Hello, ladies and gentlemen, I am your gracious host, Gitbag the Great, and welcome to the review of the game that you guys voted for to be the subject of my next playthrough, according to the straw poll I recently held on my channel, Donehoo 2. Now, this is a 2009 RTS made by Relic and THQ in accordance with Warhammer 40k's original founders, Games Workshop. This is a very, very well-made, I believe, RTS based on the Warhammer 40k franchise owned by Games Workshop, and I would say is probably not just only my favourite RTS, but also my favourite game overall. So, let's get a little bit into why I think this game is so good, and a bit of description about it. Now, the most immediate thing I think that will differentiate at least the single-player campaign of this game from previous games made by people such as THQ and Relic, my mistake, and Games Workshop is that unlike in the first Dawn of War and other RTSs made around this time, you get to name your main character. First of all, what you do is you pick, if you go into the base game, you pick if you want to play a campaign through the base game or through the first expansion pack, Chaos Rising. And then you name your character, and then you pick your difficulty setting. Nice and easy, nice and plain. Not that much of a difference, but it's just a nice little touch because you get a little bit more personalisation. In a similar way to how much of Fallout 4 works, though, you never really hear anyone say your name. The guy who you play as actually has an actual name in the Dawn of War 2 novel, which I did read a little bit of. I didn't get that far into it, so I can't remember too much about it, I must admit, even though I do actually really like reading the Warhammer 40k novels. So basically the setting of this game is that you are one of the many Space Marine chapters. You are in particular the force commander of a small force of Blood Raven Space Marines, members of the mighty and hallowed Blood Ravens chapter, who are one of the most mysterious chapters of Space Marines in the entire Imperium of Man. It's the 41st century, mankind is beset on all sides by aliens, heretics, demons, and all sorts of nasties, and your small strike team of Space Marines, led by your personal commander, are sent into the Aurelia subsystem by the higher-ups of the Blood Ravens chapter to protect your chapter's recruiting worlds. As you land on the planet of Calderis, your original captain who commanded you when you were just a lowly private is leading a small force of initiates against a massive invasion of orcs who are trying to basically overrun the entire system and the sector as a whole. Over time you find out that they're being stirred up by a force of mysterious aliens who you also have to stop, and in turn those second force of aliens are also trying to stir up the orcs in order to somehow stop a third, even larger, far greater threat of aliens who are this time a much more vociferous force than either of the two enemies you faced. I will probably leave it there because the story is worth being experienced in of itself. In all honesty, though, the story isn't really the strongest point of the game. It's a pretty simple, straightforward story, and it's not necessarily the worst written, I won't admit. But it isn't anything new. However, the thing that really does accentuate the story and really bring the game into really good spheres of atmosphere building and really good scenes for, emotion and involvement in the story, even though it is quite simple, is the voice acting and the sound design. Now, the sound design isn't always the best. In some of the cutscenes, some of the sound does overlay a little bit, as you might have just seen in the cinematic cutscene just before this in-game one, but it's not always that bad, really isn't. The voice acting, on the other hand, is virtually, if not almost, flawless in this game, as it is in the two expansion packs that ended up following this original release. They hired some really quite big names in terms of voice acting to enact the magical wonder of the writing in this game and its two expansion packs, and I'm really glad Warhammer 40k, THQ and Relic really pulled out all the stops and the cash to get in some big names for voice acting, because it really pays off. The anyone from, the main characters down to the lowly grunts are really, really well involved in the story. You really get a sense that you're fighting a war with actual characters, with actual people fighting against actual individuals of these alien races. So if the story doesn't really do it for you that much, then I'm sure the voice acting should, because it's pretty good. And for the most part, the sound design as a whole is pretty decent. Now, the gameplay is probably the second thing you'll probably notice the most, which is quite a deviation from the first Dawn of War. The Dawn of War original game was quite a straightforward RTS. Now, there's nothing absolutely wrong with that. In fact, most people prefer the first one to this game quite considerably, and I perfectly understand why, even though I prefer this game myself a little bit more. The first game was more of a large-scale base-building RTS. This one is more about low-scale, miniature sort of battles with tactical combat between squad-based units that you have to really manage really carefully, using their abilities at just precise moments, as well as managing your force overall as a large-scale tactical strategic unit, while concentrating on the small-scale tactical combat from unit to unit. So it's got quite a good variation of the kinds of situations in which you can find yourself in, as you can not only enact big-scale assaults, but also small-scale scouting runs to find your way around the enemy's flanks, and perhaps surprise them with a nice little satchel charge, or just a nice little jump from your assault marines. And one thing that really does differentiate at least the combat in the Dawn of War 2 base game, and to a certain degree the expansion packs, is the presence of RPG elements. The RPG elements in this game aren't as severe as they would be in, of course, a flat-out RPG, but they do help to give the campaign a little bit of colour and character. You are given this opportunity to create this force of your own. The characters and their lines are always going to be the same throughout the campaign, no matter how many times you play it, of course. There's not a huge amount of sort of variation in the endings you can have from this game. Even in Chaos Rising, where it has a few different endings, the amount of dialogue, it doesn't change that much. However, the real juicy meat of this game is given that little extra flavour by the RPG elements, because you're allowed to customise your force with different bits of equipment, different essentials, different bits of armour, and different kinds of weapons and weapon sets. You can almost have a completely different playstyle from makeup to makeup, depending on how you choose to equip your force. And it really, really pays off, and you can also accentuate this more by having a greater preference for some units over others. Me personally, I prefer perhaps Tarkus's tactical squad here most out of all the units in the game, at least the ones that you use in the single-player campaign. But then again, I have friends who much prefer using a much more quicker and snappier approach by accentuating the use of Sergeant Thaddeus's assault squad that you get later in the game, and Sergeant Cyrus's scout squad, who are, the main guys for subterfuge, stealthy assassinations, and getting in behind enemy lines and sabotaging them with a couple of nice little explosive mines. Now, I should get onto the units that you get throughout the single-player campaign, because they kind of are pretty much the same throughout this game and in the first expansion pack, Chaos Rising. In this one, you get your Force Commander, who you have to have in your strike team the entire time, and overall, every time you deploy, most of the time, you'll have 4 units. And you get on top of your Force Commander throughout the single-player campaign of this game the Dreadnought, which is a big metal Death Walker, pretty badass. Sergeant Thaddeus's assault squad, who are basic CQC guys armed with jump packs and melee weapons. Sergeant Tarkus here, who's basically your main line infantry, good with grenades and tactical warfare. Sergeant Avitus's heavy weapons Devastator squad, and Sergeant Cyrus's nimble little scout squad, who are very lightly armoured but are probably the most useful in terms of taking out set pieces. So you will have a lot of variety of there to pick from. In Chaos Rising, you do actually get another unit to pick from on top of all of that. And in the second expansion pack, Retribution, it's actually more so based on that sense of large-scale combat you see in the first Dawn of War. The kind of small-scale tactical combat isn't as prominent in Retribution as it is in this base game and in Chaos Rising. And now, as you'll see here, the RPG elements I mentioned earlier come into play. As you hover your cursor over a bit of new war gear or armour that you've gained through playing a mission or picking it up from a secret in a mission, you'll get a layout of the speed, attack, and other stat worth of those weapons. And not only that, but you also get a little overlay of what kind of special abilities those weapons have, because some do have certain abilities that are beneficial maybe to the amount of damage that your unit has, or the amount of energy it has, or the amount of health it has to a certain degree, or how much it accentuates the armor points that your unit has. And you'll get this from pieces of armor and equipment and war gear as well as weapons. So again, you're really given a lot of opportunity to customize your force throughout the single player campaign. On top of that, your units can also level up, and you can upgrade them in terms of what abilities they have or how many points you allocate to different stats. With my Force Commander, I've gone for his physical strength stat first, just so I can get his battle cry ability. I would personally recommend that first of all you get your guys to get the special equipment slot every single time. Now you'll see on Sergeant Tarkus's screen at the very bottom in the purple section, which is the energy stat. I would recommend going for that first. On Cyrus's squad, I believe it's on the physical strength stat, but on most of your units, the extra equipment slot is on the energy stat line. So I'd go for that first, because that way you can have a greater range of abilities to utilise in battle for pretty much all of your units. As you can see here, Sergeant Tarkus currently has 2, but if we got that one, we'd have 3. Now, one thing I should also mention when you're on this screen here, on your loadout screen for your units, is that when you hover over your cursor onto a piece of war gear or armour or equipment or whatever in the armoury, it compares side by side the equipment stats of that particular piece of weaponry you're looking at in the armoury onto the equivalent of what your unit is holding right now. Say, for example, I'm going onto my Force Commander here. I'm hovering my cursor over a bit of armour. I haven't unlocked him up to a certain level yet to get, but if you see, it looks at them side by side, the stats of both the piece of armour in the armoury as well as the piece of armour that my commander is wearing currently right now. And that's a really good way of comparing the stats and boosts that you might find more attractive to your playstyle or the particular unit you've got selected. And I think that's a really good way of just integrating a bit of extra customization and a bit of user friendliness into the game, because I mean, to be fair, I don't deny that if someone just jumped into this game for the first time, they probably would feel a bit daunted by the amount of RPG elements in place, because to be fair, RPGs by nature are a little bit unbalanced and aren't always the most user friendly. I'll admit that full out, but it does allow you to sort of ease yourself in, all nice and tasty, into the RPG elements that are at least in place in this game. And that would probably be the most, defining thing about this game, I would say, is the RPG elements and how easily it allows you to ease into them. Again, it's less so used in the multiplayer, which plays a lot more like a mix between the first Dawn of War and Company of Heroes, whereas the single player in this game plays a lot more like a cross between Company of Heroes and something like Skyrim or the first couple of Diablo games or Star Wars Jedi Knights Old Republic, something like that. So it's a very much an interesting experience, the single player campaign of Dawn of War 2. One thing that I should also mention on top of that actually is that you can carry over save files from the original base game into Chaos Rising. You can't unfortunately do that for Retribution because, well, I'll probably get onto that at a later date. But it does mean that you're allowed to carry over the stat boosts that you gave to your certain characters on a certain playthrough and allowed to continue that specific playstyle you had going in the first game into Chaos Rising. So again, there's a nice little bit of continuation. You're allowed to give a bit more of a a sort of a bit more of a run of, this is my force, these are my men, I feel like I can command them, I feel like they're my guys, I can rely on them, and carry that more so into Chaos Rising, even more so because Chaos Rising takes place a full year after the events of this base version of the game, Dawn of War 2 Vanilla. So there's a nice little bit of personalisation there on top of the significant amount of customisation you have in place. Now, what are some of the pros and cons? Well, the pros, I've kind of just basically spent most of this video nattering on about the RPG elements and how they're integrated mostly into the single player, how the multiplayer is a good mesh of complicated playstyles from different RTS games, and how the voice acting and sound design for the most part is superb throughout both this game and its 2 expansion packs. The one problem I would say with the story, though, is it is a little bit straightforward. It is somewhat generic in some places. That isn't necessarily a bad thing because it's not really that badly written. It's just, it's not terribly bad. It's just a little bit average in certain places, but it's really not bad, I would say. Not at all. Another considerable problem I would say I'd probably have is that this game does have some certain frame rate issues from time to time. They're not significantly bad, although they do particularly show themselves up in situations where you take out a large bunch of, chunked up, grouped up enemies with significant sort of area effect abilities and attacks. And that also happens in in-game cutscenes. Less so, of course, in cinematic cutscenes, but in in-game cutscenes it does sometimes happen, as well as while you're playing the game itself in actuality. So the frame rate does kind of sort of slip up a couple of times. It doesn't really happen that much too often. If you're on a low specs computer, I probably would recommend turning graphics just down just a little bit. I mean, with a current generation computer, though, you'd probably be more than able to run this on the highest possible graphic settings. Like I said, this game came out in 2009. That's 7 years ago now from when I'm recording this. Over 7 years ago now, because I think it was released in mid-2009. And I think Retribution, I think it might have been released in 2011 or so, if I remember correctly. And that itself had used roughly the same settings. All in all, I'd probably say I'd give this game, generally speaking, a 9 out of 10. That's based purely on my own personal enjoyment of it, as I believe it is probably my favourite game of all time. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you're looking forward to the playthrough of it as much as I am. As always, I've been Gitbag the Great. Stay tuned, and until next time, I'll see you guys on the